don't translate. Just don't translate. Just use your target language. If I already spoke that language, I wouldn't need to learn it, would I? We're told this, don't translate, a lot. And it goes back decades. I remember not translating being a huge selling point back when I was hawking Rosetta Stone on CD-ROM 20 years ago in a hallway in Grand Central. Now, translation is not all bad, but there's actually a reason that people say this. The benefits of learning without translation are pretty serious, but it's rare that anybody tells you how to learn a language without translating, and I'm guilty of this too. So today I'm going to explain how to learn new material in your target language without translating, or how to move from translation very quickly to thinking in your target language. Different people have different approaches, and I've walked back from the total immersion with no possibility of translation kick that I was on 20 years ago. So, what I'm going to present here is 3 easy, doable steps that anybody can implement no matter where you are in your language learning journey to get started thinking in your target language rather than translating it through your first language. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I have a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a language lover and avid language learner. On the channel, I talk about linguistics, culture, and of course, how we can apply the empirical research to make our lives a little bit easier and a little bit better. So stick around. Today we're talking 3 easy ways you'll be able to finally say how I learned to stop translating and love the target language.
I must confess, you have an astonishingly good idea there, Doctor.
I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. Right off the bat, there's an important question to ask. Why bother trying not to translate? Wouldn't it be easier to just translate? And I think this is actually an important and valid question to address. People who use another language well, whether reading, listening, or speaking, do not translate through their primary language all the time, or even most of the time. First, it's just slower. The neuroscience is clear. If you're processing information and adding a step, it's just slower than not doing that. If you can go from concept to French without having to take a detour through English and vice versa, you're just going to be faster. In an epistolary correspondence, that doesn't really matter, but when you're talking to somebody face to face, they don't want to watch you grinding your gears. And all the more so if we're talking a language like Mandarin, or really any language that isn't the basis of like 70% of English because they conquered England 1,000 years ago. This is in part because, as will be a surprise to nobody, languages aren't the same. What often is a surprise to people is in just how many ways they differ. So to keep to really simple, really concrete examples, basically anything that's gradient, we divide up differently. Russian has 2 words for shades of what English calls blue. Japanese historically only had 1 word for all of those and what English calls green. Anything that doesn't have clearly delineated natural boundaries, languages will have different numbers of boundaries in different places along those continua with different centers of focus. It's not just colors. I have not 1, not 2, but 3 books on my shelf about how different languages and cultures conceive of emotions in radically, fundamentally different ways. Beyond that, as John Rupert Firth once said, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. When we know a language, truly know it, it's not just a mapping between concepts and sounds. A word in your mental lexicon is connected to many, many other words, both by shared sounds, conceptual links, and all sorts of mental networks of priming. This is where you get allusion and innuendo and connotations and so on. The problem with translation is that it's just shallow. You end up with the mental connections of your primary language and a thin veneer of target language over the ways of thinking and semantic, emotional, and linguistic networks of your L1. The words may or may not be right, but they're divorced from the flow of ideas in the target language. Don't worry, I'm not going full-on Sapir-Whorf here, but there is something to be said for cultural nuances and for priming effects. So, great, I've convinced you. How do you actually do that? How do you actually not translate? I'm certain there's other ways than what I'm about to explain, but what I've used and enjoyed is a 3-part process. The second and third parts are not necessarily sequential, which is why I didn't say a 3-step process. The first step is the same, and paradoxically it starts with, and you're not going to like this, you're not going to believe it, but trust me, bro, use translation. Now, hear me out. I mean this in a very narrow and specific way in a very restricted domain. and you don't have to always use translation to do this, but it's optional in the first part. So the idea is to start getting a small stock of basic words in your language and then use them as building blocks to scaffold to not using translation. Start concrete and tangible. Many of Gabriel Weiner's 625 words are good candidates. If you don't know who that is, watch my video on his book Fluent Forever. I'll link that at the end. As quickly as possible, you want to associate your new word with an image. Ideally, you'd play Weiner's game of spot the differences. So once you learn that dog is собака in Russian, you'd get your images in order and then jettison dog from your entire process. When you make flashcards or used spaced repetition or whatever, you get nothing for recognizing that this image is a dog. You're trying to link this image to собака. This is where you would use mnemonics, especially phonological mnemonics and naughty mnemonics. Phonological mnemonics can be as stupid as собака. It's a barker. Собака, to help you remember. You'll move past these pretty quickly, but they're surprisingly, annoyingly effective. And this is where you use your vivid imagination and any personal connections that you have. Were you once afraid of a dog when you were a child because you thought it was trying to attack you? That dog is the собака. Now's as good a time as any to apologize to any Russian speakers watching this for my accent. So this step only gets you so far. It's particularly helpful with those things that don't overlap, like синий and голубой. But you can't do this for everything. And it really doesn't get you those mental mappings and associations that I talked about earlier. So step 2 is to get lots of examples of use in the language. Now, you might think, Jonesy boy, I know what a dog is. What's your deal? Well, it's those associations. It gives you the variety of uses and shades of nuance. And getting all of those examples can work below the level of consciousness. See my video on learning and sleep for more on that. Beyond that, it's reinforcement that contributes to long-term memorization without the active practice of memorization, for instance, with Anki or other spaced repetition software. Of course, you can also use Anki and even dump in a bunch of sentences. I do close deletion, basically fill in the blanks for this. But personally, I prefer doing that with a twist that I'll explain in a minute. Now, people suggest lots of reading. This is fine. It's fine. I love to read. I love the idea of passively learning by engaging with content by either reading or watching TV. I have some skepticism about what passes for the comprehensible input approach, but this is definitely a way to see words in context. The problem with making this your entire approach, however, is that it's unstructured. You don't determine how much or how often you see certain words or structures. You just read a book and you get what you get. It's suboptimal, but fun. So that knowing a word by the company it keeps, one way I like to Google stalk a word's friends is to use something like reverso context as a simple hack. I don't spend a ton of time with it for any one word, but it's a pretty good hack. For instance, keeping with my sabaki, you can type in my accent's so bad. You can type in dog and you get a few candidate translations. Staying with sabaka, you get a sentence like, a dog flea can easily spread from one dog to another, and the pedigreed dog won the first place at the prestigious dog show this year. But I learned another word for dog in Russian is pios, and that ends up used in sentences like, only the guard dog barked harshly at the old woman, and the annoying yapping neighbor's dog disturbed the peaceful evening, and little old lady got her head bitten off by her own dog. We're definitely building a different mental and emotional network here for pios, and it will relate in form and color how we think of sabaka later. I use translations here, but don't fixate on translating, just get the feel. And notice what links the disparate translations. Lastly, don't try to memorize sentences and translations. We're looking for phrases and chunks. Phrases in the linguistic sense is less than a sentence, maybe a noun and its adjective, or a verb and adverb, or something. So like, incessant yapping goes with pios. But basically, what words does your word show up with consistently? Which patterns keep occurring? What grammatical patterns keep showing up? This can be as simple as it's always followed by this preposition and not that one. And that starts to be your chunk. Lastly, make connections. One way is to use a monolingual dictionary in your target language once you get to that point. Another is to attempt to use your target language to define or rephrase something with the tools you currently have at your disposal. And this is a great way to learn new vocabulary and remember it as you're learning it. Basically, the entire process is one of trying to jettison your L1 as early as possible and work around it and get in the habit of doing so. The neuroscience is clear as well that bilingualism involves suppressing your other languages, and that's a skill that takes time to develop. So be patient with yourself. Lastly, and this is very important, you need to do this not just with words, but with grammatical structures. It's a similar idea, and I'm not averse to translation at first. You can get familiar with structures by using things like close deletion with words you already know. I discussed this in the video on Fluent Forever. But one key idea that many people don't intuit without it being explained is that when you're thinking of what to say and how to say it in another language, you should be manipulating phrases, not individual words. Again, phrases in this context mean something like a noun phrase, which would include all the adjectives and determiners and so on. Your goal is to be able to quickly generate the incessant yapping of the pios as one thing. And then whatever you want to say about it will be their own bigger units where you're not just laboriously putting one word after another and trying to figure out case marking one at a time. So maybe doesn't bother me as a chunk, and because it will be dead soon is another, and of the cold is the last one. It's these phrases that have to agree internally and have to fit together in terms of case marking and so on. So there you have it. There's probably other ways, but this has been what works for me. I'm not afraid of translation, but that's because I know that any translation is just an approximation that can't actually tell me the meaning and connotations of a word. It can only point me in the right direction. Hopefully this helped explain the reasoning behind the suggestion to not translate, what it actually means, and how to practically go about it. It's not something that we just intuit. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like and subscribe and leave me a comment. It is great for the algorithm. You can support the channel on YouTube with super thanks or at patreon.com/languagejones. Until next time, happy learning.